The dust was a living thing. It coated Alara's tongue, a fine grit that spoke of failed rains and a sky bleached of all mercy. It settled in the lines of her hands, in a worn weave of her husband's shirt, which now hung from her thin frame like a shroud. The wind, a constant, mournful companion on this forsaken patch of the plains, did not cool. It only scoured, lifting the last of the topsoil from her blighted fields and carrying it away to the east, a funeral procession for a dead dream. Each gust whispered a name she could no longer bear to hear. Thomas. He had called this land a promise. He had seen the endless horizon not as an emptiness, but as a canvas. Now, the canvas was blank, cracked, and all the color had been leached from it, just as it had been from her life. Her corn stalks stood like brittle skeletons, their heads bowed in a permanent attitude of defeat. The beans had shriveled on the vine, turning to black, rattling pebbles in their pods. The potatoes, when she had dug them with desperate, bleeding fingers, were small and rotten, infested with a blight that had consumed them from the inside out. The promise was broken. The earth had given them nothing back. Inside the small sod cabin, the silence was heavier than the dust. It was a weighted presence, filled with the ghosts of laughter and the echoes of plans made by firelight. The larder was a testament to her failure. A half-full sack of flour, crawling with weevils. A few wrinkled onions. A small jar of salt. It was the inventory of starvation, a slow and quiet surrender. For weeks, she had rationed, telling herself the rains would come. Then she had prayed, her words swallowed by the indifferent wind. Now, prayer felt like a foolish luxury. Hope had withered alongside the corn. There was only the gnawing in her belly and a cold, clear-eyed fear that was more honest than any prayer had ever been. She could pack the wagon with what little remained and go back. Back to what? To the pity of her sister in Ohio, to the cloying sympathy of a town that had always seen her and Thomas as fools for heading west. To admit that the wilderness had broken her, that Thomas had died for nothing more than a patch of sterile dirt. The shame of it was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath a shallow, difficult thing. No, she would not be broken. Not yet. There was one last, desperate option, a name spoken in hushed, wary tones in the distant town of Redemption. Silas Blackwood, her nearest neighbor, if a man who lived 2 miles away across the unforgiving prairie could be called such a thing. No one knew where he came from. He had arrived a few years before them, claiming a parcel of land no one else wanted, a harsh acreage of rock and ravine. He kept to himself, a gaunt, solitary figure seen only on rare trips to town for supplies, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat, his eyes missing nothing. The townspeople traded rumors like currency. He was a deserter, a wanted man, perhaps even a killer. They said his silence was not one of peace, but of a dark and troubled past. Thomas had warned her to keep her distance. Some men are meant to be islands. Alara, he'd said. Best to let them be. But Thomas was gone, and his cautionary words were just another ghost in a house full of them. An island might have what she needed. An island, by its very nature, had to be self-sufficient. He had to have survived. He had to have seeds. The thought of approaching him sent a tremor of fear through her, a cold counterpoint to the fire of her hunger. It was an act of supreme vulnerability, an admission of utter defeat to a man who was a stranger, an enigma, a potential threat. To walk on his land would be a trespass. To ask for help would be to place her fate in the hands of a man the world had seemingly cast out. She stood at the door of her cabin, one hand on the rough-hewn frame, and looked out at the vast, crushing expanse. The sun was a merciless eye in the pale sky. Her land was a graveyard of hope. His land, in the distance, was a dark, uninviting slash against the horizon. For a long time, she stood there, caught between the slow death of starvation and the sharp, immediate terror of the unknown. The wind pulled at her hair, whipping strands across her face. It felt like a warning, but the gnawing in her stomach was a more insistent voice. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, she stepped out of the cabin and began to walk. The dust rose in little puffs around her worn boots, the only sound in a world that had gone profoundly, terribly quiet. She did not look back. There was nothing there to see. The walk to Silas Blackwood's homestead was a pilgrimage through desolation. The prairie grass, which should have been green and knee-high, was the color of old straw, crunching underfoot. The sun beat down, and the air shimmered with a heat that distorted the distance, making his property seem to retreat with every step she took. Her own land had been chosen for its flatness, its seeming suitability for farming. His was different. As she drew closer, she saw the harshness of it. The ground rose and fell, littered with stones that looked like the bleached bones of the earth. Gnarled, stunted trees clung to the sides of a dry creek bed, their branches twisted into shapes of agony. It was a place that did not welcome life, but dared it to exist. And yet, exist it did. She saw it first as a dark line on the horizon, a fence, stark and well-mended. A proper fence, not like the collapsing lines of wire and hope she had left behind. Beyond it, a small, sturdy cabin sat low to the ground, built of dark timber and stone, looking as if it had grown from the bedrock itself. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney, a sign of life that both terrified and compelled her. She reached the fence line and stopped, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it, the boundary between her world of failure and his world of survival. There was no gate, only the taut wire. She could see him now, a tall figure behind the cabin, splitting wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a steady, powerful heartbeat in the oppressive silence. He moved with an economy of motion, each swing precise, purposeful. He was not a large man, but wiry and strong, the muscles in his back and shoulders cording with each blow. He wore dark, simple clothes, practical and devoid of any adornment. He seemed as much a part of the harsh landscape as the rocks and twisted trees. She watched him for what felt like an eternity, the words she had rehearsed turning to ash in her mouth. How could she ask this man for anything? He was a creature of pure competence, of stark survival. Her own inadequacy felt like a physical stain on her skin. He must have sensed her presence. He stopped mid-swing, the axe held aloft, and slowly turned his head. His face was angular, weathered by sun and wind, and partially obscured by a dark, untrimmed beard. But his eyes, even from this distance, were sharp and piercing. They settled on her, and she felt pinned by their intensity, a moth skewered to a board. He did not call out, did not wave. He simply watched her, his stillness more unnerving than any shout would have been. Her breath hitched. All the fight, all the desperate resolve that had carried her across the 2 miles of blighted prairie seemed to evaporate under that unwavering gaze. She felt stripped bare, her hunger, her fear, her shame all laid out for his inspection. He lowered the axe slowly, deliberately, and leaned it against the woodpile. Then he began to walk toward her, his stride unhurried, measured. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man utterly at home in his own territory. She held her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to turn and run. She clutched her hands together, her knuckles white. As he drew closer, she could see the details of his face, the deep lines etched around his eyes, a faint, pale scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was not old, perhaps only a few years more than Thomas had been, but he looked as if he had lived 1,000 hard years. He stopped a few feet from the fence on his side. The wire was a tangible barrier between them, a line drawn in the dust. He said nothing. The silence stretched, pulled taut by the wind. It was her move. She had come here. She had trespassed on his solitude. She had to force the words from her throat. They came out as a dry, cracking whisper, almost lost to the wind. Mr. Blackwood. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His eyes, a startlingly pale gray, like a winter sky, never left her face. They held no warmth, but no malice either. They were simply observant, assessing. She swallowed, the dust in her throat making it painful. I'm Alara Vance. From a neighboring claim, another slight nod. He knew who she was. Of course he knew. A man like this would know everything that happened within his sight line. He would have watched them arrive, watched them build their home, watched them plant their crops. He would have watched them fail. The shame burned hotter. My crops, they didn't take, she stammered, the confession costing her more than she could have imagined. The rain, her voice trailed off. There was no need to explain. He could see the truth in the sky, feel it in the parched earth beneath his boots. He waited, his patience a formidable, unyielding thing. She took a final, shuddering breath, the plea she had come to make feeling like a beggar's cry. She met his gaze, forcing herself not to look away, to show him that even in her desperation, there was a core of something left. I came to ask if you would share your seeds, neighbor, for the next planting. I have nothing left. Silas Blackwood did not answer. He simply stood on his side of the wire, his pale eyes fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. The wind soughed between them, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant, unattainable rain. For a moment, Elara thought he hadn't heard her, or perhaps that he had dismissed her words as the meaningless babble of a desperate woman. The silence was a physical thing, pressing in on her, amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. She could see the careful order of his property behind him. The neat stack of firewood, the small but hardy-looking vegetable patch near the cabin, sheltered by a low stone wall. A rain barrel, full, stood by the eaves of his roof. Everything spoke of foresight, of careful planning, of a man who understood the unforgiving nature of this land and had made his peace with it, not by hoping for its mercy, but by demanding nothing and preparing for the worst. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the hopeful folly of her own homestead, with its failed fields and empty well. He had not gambled on rain. He had prepared for drought. Finally, he spoke. His voice was lower than she had expected, a rough baritone that seemed scraped raw by disuse, yet it carried easily on the wind. Seeds are not given. The words were not cruel, merely a statement of fact, as unadorned and solid as a rock. It was the law of this place. Nothing was given. Everything was earned, or it was taken. The flicker of hope in her chest guttered and died, leaving behind a cold, familiar dread. Of course, it had been a fool's errand. She had debased herself for nothing. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. She lowered her gaze to the cracked ground, unable to bear the intensity of his stare any longer. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. I see. I'm sorry to have troubled you. She turned to leave, each movement stiff with defeat. The 2-mile walk back to her empty cabin stretched before her like a death sentence. I didn't say no. The words stopped her, her back still to him. She turned slowly, cautiously, not daring to let hope rekindle. He hadn't moved. He was still standing by the fence, his arms resting on the top wire, his posture relaxed but rooted. They are earned, he repeated, his gaze unwavering. He looked her over again, from the worn soles of her boots to the desperation in her eyes. It was not a man's appraisal of a woman, but a homesteader's appraisal of a potential hand. He was measuring her strength, her endurance, her will. My fence to the north needs mending. The rock field by the creek bed needs clearing if I'm a plant to come spring. The well needs to be dug deeper before winter. He listed the tasks without inflection. They were not requests. They were facts. A mountain of labor. You work, he said, the pale eyes seeming to bore right through her. You earn your seed. The offer, if it could be called that, hung in the air between them. It was not charity. It was a transaction, as stark and unsentimental as the landscape itself. He was offering her a chance, not a handout. A chance to trade her labor for her survival. Part of her recoiled at the idea. She was Thomas's widow, the mistress of her own homestead. She was not a hired hand. The townspeople's whispers already painted her as a failure. What would they say if they saw her toiling on the land of the reclusive Silas Blackwood? But what did their whispers matter? They wouldn't fill her belly. They wouldn't put seed in the ground. The pride she was clinging to was a useless, flimsy thing, a luxury she could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that held any value here. She looked at her own hands, calloused and scraped from her own failed efforts. They were capable of work. Her body was weak from hunger, but it was not yet broken. Here was a path. A hard, grueling, humiliating path. But it was a path away from the slow, quiet death waiting for her in the sod cabin. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. The tremor in her hands had stilled. A new feeling was taking root in the barren soil of her spirit. Not hope, not yet, but a grim, hard resolve. She would not be a victim. She would not be an object of pity. She would earn her future. "When do I start?" she asked, her voice clearer now, stronger. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his expression. It wasn't a smile, not even close. It was a faint, almost imperceptible nod of approval. Acknowledgement. "Sun up," he said. He didn't offer to show her where to cross the fence or invite her in. The terms had been set. He turned without another word and walked back toward his cabin, retrieving his axe and resuming his work. The steady thud, thud, thud of the blade splitting wood echoed across the prairie. The sound was no longer menacing. It was the sound of survival. Alara stood for a moment longer, the wind whipping her dress around her legs. Then she turned and began the long walk back. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. The journey back did not feel like a retreat. It felt like a preparation for battle. The next morning, Alara rose before the sun had breached the horizon. The air was cool and thin, and the eastern sky was a pale, bruised purple. She moved with a purpose she had not felt in months, a grim energy born of necessity. She ate the last of her edible onions and a small, hard piece of bread, washing it down with the brackish water from her nearly dry well. It was a meager meal, but it would have to be enough. She tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and put on Thomas's sturdy work trousers, tucking them into her boots. The clothes of her old life, the calico dresses and aprons, felt like costumes from a play that had long since ended. Today, she was not a wife or a widow. She was a laborer. As she walked towards Silas Blackwood's property in the pre-dawn gloom, the world seemed to hold its breath. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of her boots on the parched earth. She felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. What had she agreed to? Could she do this? The tasks he had listed were man's work, heavy and relentless. Her body, weakened by grief and poor nutrition, felt frail and inadequate. But for every wave of doubt, a stronger current of resolve pushed back. She would not fail. She would not give him a reason to send her away. She arrived at the fence line as the first rays of sun spilled over the plains, painting the dead grass in hues of gold and rose. He was already there, waiting for her. He stood with a coil of wire over one shoulder and a post-hole digger in his hand. He gave her a curt nod, his expression as impassive as it had been the day before. "The north line," he said, gesturing with his head. "Follow me." He turned and set off without waiting to see if she was behind him. She ducked under the wire fence, the metal cool against the back of her neck, and hurried to catch up. He set a punishing pace, his long legs eating up the rough terrain. She had a half jog to keep from falling behind, her lungs already burning in the thin morning air. They walked for nearly a mile, to the far edge of his property where the land dipped into a series of rocky ravines. The fence here was in shambles. Several posts were rotted through, leaning at drunken angles, and the wire was a tangled, rusted mess. It was a formidable task. He didn't waste time with instructions. He dropped the coil of wire and handed her a pair of thick leather gloves and a set of wire cutters. Pull the old wire. Pile the old posts. His orders were clipped precise. He then moved to the first rotted post and began to dig around its base, his movements fluid and powerful. The message was clear: watch and learn. Alara pulled on the gloves. They were large and stiff, clearly his, but she was grateful for them. She set to work on the tangled wire. It was a frustrating, painful job. The rusted strands were brittle and sharp, snagging on her clothes and scratching at her arms despite the gloves. She had to wrestle with each section, untangling knots and snipping through the worst of it with the heavy cutters, which required all the strength in her hands to close. Beside her, Silas worked in a steady, relentless rhythm. The thud of his digger striking the hard, rocky soil was a constant metronome, measuring her own slow, clumsy progress. He didn't speak, didn't look at her, didn't offer a word of encouragement or criticism. His focus was absolute, his presence an immense, silent pressure. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, beating down on her back. Sweat stung her eyes and pasted her shirt to her skin. Her muscles, unused to such sustained, heavy labor, began to scream in protest. Her back ached, her shoulders burned, and her hands, even inside the gloves, were rubbed raw. More than once, she stumbled, a wave of dizziness washing over her from hunger and exertion. Each time, she caught herself, gritted her teeth, and went back to work. She would not collapse. She would not show weakness. She glanced at him occasionally. He seemed tireless, a machine of sinew and bone. He had dug out 3 old posts and was starting on the 4th hole before she had even cleared 50 feet of wire. The sheer disparity in their output was a fresh humiliation. She felt a surge of resentment. He could have given her an easier task, something to ease her into the work. But he hadn't. He was testing her, she realized, pushing her to her limit to see where it was. He wanted to know if she would break. The thought hardened her resolve. She pulled at a stubborn tangle of wire with a grunt, pouring all her frustration and anger into the effort. The wire snapped free, and she stumbled back, landing hard on the ground. She sat there for a moment, the dust swirling around her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She expected a comment, a look of derision, but he didn't even pause in his digging. It was as if she didn't exist. That somehow was worse. She scrambled back to her feet, her cheeks burning with shame, and grabbed the wire cutters again, her movements fueled by a fresh wave of angry determination. By midday, the sun was a white-hot hammer in the sky. Alara's world had shrunk to the next rusted strand of wire, the next stubborn tangle. Her thirst was a raging fire in her throat. She had not brought water, a foolish, prideful oversight. She had assumed he would provide it, or that they would break for it. They had not. He worked on, seemingly immune to the heat and the thirst. She watched him lift a heavy new post and drop it into a freshly dug hole, the thud of it landing echoing in the dry air. He was a force of nature, as unyielding as the land he worked. Finally, when she felt she could not go on another minute, that her tongue was a swollen, useless thing in her mouth, he stopped. He straightened up, wiping a forearm across his brow, and looked not at her, but at the sun. "Noon," he said, as if to himself. He walked over to a small canvas sack she hadn't noticed before, which he had left in the shade of a large boulder. He pulled out a canteen and a cloth-wrapped bundle. He drank first a long, deep swallow. Then he walked over to her, holding out the canteen. She stared at it, her pride warring with her desperate need. To take it was to admit her own lack of foresight, her weakness. But the thirst was an agony. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took it from him. The metal was cool against her raw fingers. She lifted it to her lips and drank, the water tasting sweeter than anything she had ever known. She drank too much, too fast, and choked, coughing as the water spilled down her chin. She could feel his eyes on her, and the shame was so intense it was dizzying. But when she lowered the canteen, his expression was unchanged. Impassive, unreadable. He took the canteen back and then handed her a piece of dry bread and a thick slice of salted meat from the bundle. She ate it mechanically, her hunger so great she barely tasted it. They ate in silence, standing a few feet apart in the meager shade of the boulder. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was just empty, a space filled only by the whisper of the wind and the vastness of the sky. When they were finished, he took the cloth, folded it neatly, and put it back in the sack. "Back to work," he said, and turned back to the fence line. There was no respite, no softness. There was only the work and the earning. The storm came without warning. One moment, the sky was the same merciless, bleached blue it had been for months. The next, the horizon to the west had turned a bruised, angry purple. The wind, which had been a constant, hot breath, suddenly shifted, carrying with it the distant, metallic scent of rain and a chill that raised the hairs on Alara's arms. Silas stopped working, his shovel halfway through a swing. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted, tasting the air like an animal. Alara had been so consumed by her work, clearing the seemingly endless field of rocks he had assigned her after the fence, that she hadn't even noticed the change. Her back was a column of fire, her hands blistered and bleeding inside her gloves. Each rock she lifted from the soil and carried to the growing pile at the edge of the field felt like a small, personal victory against the unyielding earth. Now, she straightened up, following his gaze. The clouds were boiling towards them, a dark, churning mass that swallowed the sunlight. The speed of it was terrifying. "Barn," he said. The single word was not a suggestion, it was a command. He dropped his shovel and started toward his cabin at a brisk walk that was nearly a run. "Bring the tools." Alara didn't hesitate. She gathered the shovel and the heavy pickaxe, her tired muscles protesting with every movement, and hurried after him. The wind was a physical force now, whipping her hair across her face and tearing at her clothes. Dust and loose straw flew through the air, stinging her eyes. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall as they reached the small, sturdy barn that stood beside his cabin. They were not gentle drops. They hit the parched ground with audible splats, raising little puffs of dust. Silas heaved the heavy barn door open, the wood groaning in protest against the wind, and gestured for her to go inside. She stumbled in, dropping the tools with a clatter, and he followed, pulling the door shut behind them just as the sky opened up. The sound was deafening. The rain came down not in sheets, but as a solid, roaring deluge, hammering on the barn's timber roof like 1,000 frantic drums. A moment later, the first crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a boom of thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. Inside, the world was plunged into a dim, dusty twilight, the only light coming from the small cracks between the wallboards. The air was thick with the smell of hay, animals, and dry earth. Alara leaned against the rough wall, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged pants. The sudden violence of the storm was overwhelming. Outside, the world was being scoured, washed clean. Inside, there was a strange, suspended peace. The barn was larger than it looked from the outside. A few stalls lined one wall, one of which was occupied by a placid-looking mule. The other side was stacked high with hay bales, and tools hung in neat, orderly rows from wooden pegs. Everything was clean, organized, purposeful, like the man himself. Silas moved through the gloom with an easy familiarity. He lit a lantern, and a warm, golden light pushed back the shadows, revealing the motes of dust dancing in the air. The small flame seemed a fragile, defiant thing against the fury of the storm raging outside. He didn't speak to her, but went about his chores, checking on the mule, securing a loose board on one of the stalls. Alara simply watched, grateful for the chance to rest, to let the trembling in her limbs subside. The storm was a force beyond their control, an interruption to the relentless rhythm of work he had established. It forced them into this shared space, this unwilling proximity. The thunder cracked again, closer this time, and she flinched, an involuntary jerk of her shoulders. She had always hated storms. They reminded her of her own helplessness, of the terrifying power of a world that could sweep away everything you held dear in a single, violent moment. Silas must have seen her reaction. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. His face was half in shadow, the lantern light carving deep lines into his features. "It will pass," he said. His voice was quiet, matter of fact. It was the first thing he had said to her that wasn't an order. It was a simple statement, but in the roaring chaos of the storm, it felt like an anchor. He then walked over to a small, makeshift workbench in the corner. From a crate beneath it, he pulled out 2 tin cups and a small, blackened pot. He produced a flask from his coat pocket and poured a measure of dark liquid into each cup, then topped them off with water from a covered bucket. He handed one of the cups to her. "Drink," he said. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a brief second. His hand was rough, calloused, but there was a surprising warmth to it. She looked at the cup. The liquid was dark, smelling faintly of coffee and something sharper like whiskey. She hesitated. He seemed to read her mind. "It'll warm you." She took a tentative sip. It was strong, bitter coffee, laced with just enough liquor to send a thread of heat unfurling through her chest. It was bracing and strangely comforting. They drank in silence, listening to the storm rage outside. The rain on the roof was a constant, drumming roar. The world beyond these four walls had ceased to exist. There was only the golden circle of lantern light, the smell of hay, and the shared, unspoken vulnerability of two people taking shelter from a force greater than themselves. She watched him over the rim of her cup. In the soft light, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. He was looking out a small, grimy window, his gaze distant, his thoughts his own. She wondered about the scar above his eye, about the solitude he had chosen, about the man behind the unreadable mask of competence. For the first time, she saw him not as a taskmaster or a savior, but simply as a man who, like her, was trying to survive in this hard, lonely place. "The rain," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's good for the soil." He turned his head from the window and looked at her. His pale eyes seemed to hold the lantern light, reflecting it back at her. He gave a slow nod. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes it washes everything away." His gaze held hers for a long moment, and in that moment, she felt a profound and unspoken understanding pass between them. They were both people who knew what it was to have things washed away. The storm raged on, but inside the barn, something had shifted. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a fragile, tentative connection, a quiet recognition of their shared humanity in the face of the storm. The weeks that followed the storm settled into a new rhythm. The rain had been a baptism, washing the dust from the air and softening the hard-baked earth. A faint, hopeful tinge of green began to appear on the distant hills, a fragile promise in a land that had offered none. The work on Silas's homestead continued, relentless and grueling, but something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between them. The sharp edges of their transaction had begun to blur. It was no longer just about her earning her seeds. It was about the shared, daily struggle against the land itself. The silence between them remained, a vast and constant presence, but it was no longer the tense, watchful silence of their first days together. It had become a comfortable quiet, a space that didn't need to be filled with meaningless words. They learned to communicate through a shared language of action and observation. A nod of his head was praise for a well-mended fence post. The way she laid out the tools at the end of the day, clean and in their proper place, was a sign of her respect for his methods. She was learning. Every day was a lesson taught not with words, but with demonstration. She learned to read the subtle shifts in the color of the soil, to know which patches would hold water and which would turn to dust. She learned how to brace a post against the constant push of the wind, how to sharpen the blade of an axe with a whetstone until it could shave a hair from her arm. She learned the quiet patience of mending a harness, the slow, methodical stitching that made the leather strong again. These were Thomas's skills she had watched but never truly absorbed, always deferring to his confident expertise. Now, she was acquiring them for herself, through the sweat of her own brow and the ache in her own muscles. Silas was a demanding teacher. He accepted no shortcuts, no half measures. A job was to be done correctly, or it was to be done again. At first, his exacting standards had felt like a criticism of her own past failures. But she came to realize it wasn't personal. It was his philosophy for survival. This land did not forgive carelessness. It punished mistakes with brutal efficiency. To do a job well was not a matter of pride. It was a matter of life and death. Her body changed. The soft, rounded lines of her former life were planed away, replaced by hard, wiry muscle. Her hands, once her small vanity, became permanently calloused, the skin tough and stained with earth. She grew stronger, not just physically, but in some deeper, more essential way. The gnawing fear that had been her constant companion for months began to recede, replaced by a quiet competence. She no longer felt like a victim waiting for fate to deal its next blow. She was an active participant in her own survival. One evening, as she was clearing the last of the rocks from the field by the creek bed, her shovel struck something that wasn't a stone. It made a dull, metallic thud. Curious, she dug around it, unearthing a small, rusted tin box. It was heavy. She pried the lid open with the edge of her shovel. Inside, nestled in the dirt, was a collection of small, carved wooden figures. A bird with delicate, outstretched wings. A resting deer. A wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl. They were exquisitely detailed, carved with a skill and patience that seemed utterly at odds with the harshness of their surroundings. She looked up toward the cabin, where Silas was mending a saddle on his porch. This had to be his. This secret artistry, this hidden gentleness. It was a glimpse behind the stoic facade, a hint of a life lived before this one, a life that had room for such small, beautiful, useless things. She closed the box and carefully reburied it, leaving his secret safe in the earth. It felt like a trust she had been given, and one she would keep. He began to share more than just work with her. The midday meal, once a silent, perfunctory affair, became a ritual. He would build a small fire, and they would cook a simple meal together, bacon and beans, or a thick stew made from dried vegetables and the occasional rabbit he caught in his snares. He taught her how to make passable coffee by roasting chicory root over the coals. During these moments, he would sometimes speak, offering small, disconnected fragments of his past. He never spoke of where he came from or why he had come here, but he talked of the woods he had known as a boy, of the way the light filtered through pine trees, of the feel of a river current against his legs. His words painted pictures of a world far from this sun-scoured plain, a world of green and shade and moving water. She, in turn, found herself speaking of Thomas, not of his death or of her grief, but of the small things. The way he would hum off-key when he was working. His ridiculous belief that he could predict the weather by watching the ants. Sharing these memories no longer felt like tearing open a wound. It felt like honoring him, like admitting that the love they had shared was a part of her strength now, not just her sorrow. One afternoon, a wheel on her old wagon, which she used to haul water from the creek to his rain barrel, finally gave out. The wood dried and brittle, splintered, and the entire thing collapsed. It was a disaster. The wagon was essential, and she had no way to fix it. She stood staring at the wreckage, a wave of the old despair washing over her. It was a reminder of how precarious her existence still was, how easily things could fall apart. She expected Silas to be angry, to see it as her fault. Instead, he simply surveyed the damage with his usual calm, his gaze analytical. "The wood is rotten," he stated. He spent the rest of the afternoon and all of the next day painstakingly rebuilding the wheel. He didn't ask for her help, but she stayed with him, handing him tools, holding pieces of wood in place as he worked. She watched his hands, strong and surprisingly deft, as he shaped the new spokes, as he fitted the iron rim, heating in the fire until it glowed red-hot, and then quenching it so it would shrink tight around the wood. It was a masterclass in craftsmanship and patience. When it was done, the new wheel was stronger than the original had ever been. He had taken something broken and made it whole again, made it better. As he fitted the wheel back onto the axle, he looked at her. "Things break," he said, his voice low. "You learn to fix them." She knew he wasn't just talking about the wagon wheel. He was talking about her. He was talking about them both. The arrival of Mr. Henderson was as unwelcome and invasive as a swarm of locusts. He came on a fine chestnut horse, a stark contrast to the hardy, common stock of the homesteaders, and his clothes, a dark suit and a bowler hat, were laughably out of place against the vast, dusty backdrop of the plains. He reeked of city smoke, pomade, and a cloying, predatory ambition. Alara saw him first, a dark speck on the horizon, heading not for Silas's property, but for hers. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. She knew his type. They were the carrion birds of the frontier, circling the weak and the unfortunate, waiting for them to fail so they could pick the bones of their dreams. He reined in his horse near her dilapidated cabin, his gaze sweeping over the failed fields, the leaning fence, the general air of abandonment. A smug, satisfied smile played on his lips. He saw exactly what he had expected to see, an opportunity. "Good day, ma'am," he called out, his voice smooth and oily. He dismounted with a practiced ease, taking off his hat and holding it over his heart in a gesture of mock respect. "Chester Henderson, from the Territorial Land Office. I was just passing through, checking on the claims in this sector." He was lying, of course. Men like Henderson never just passed through. Their movements were as calculated as a wolf's. Alara stood her ground, her hands resting on the handles of the wheelbarrow she had been using to haul rocks. She did not invite him closer. She did not offer him a polite greeting. The work she had been doing on Silas's land had hardened her, stripped away the pleasantries, and left behind a core of wary resolve. She simply waited, her expression uninviting. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he plastered it back on. "A tough season, I see," he said, gesturing vaguely at her blighted corn stalks. "A real shame. This land can be unforgiving, especially for a woman on her own." The condescension in his voice was a physical irritant, like grit in her eye. He was probing for weakness, for the despair he could leverage. "My husband and I filed this claim together," she said, her voice steady and cold. She made sure to emphasize the word my. "The land is mine." Henderson's eyes flickered with a brief, acquisitive light. Of course. My condolences on your loss, Mrs. Vance. It only underscores the difficulty of your position. The railroad has expressed an interest in acquiring certain parcels along this corridor for future expansion. They're prepared to offer a fair price, of course. A chance for you to start fresh, somewhere more forgiving. He made it sound like a kindness, a generous offer of rescue. But she heard the truth beneath the honeyed words. He was offering her pennies for her land, for Thomas's grave, for the last vestiges of their shared dream. He wanted to erase her, to swallow her claim and move on to the next. "I'm not selling," she said. The words were quiet, but they held the weight of all the rocks she had hauled, all the fences she had mended. They were solid, immovable. Henderson's practiced smile tightened at the edges. He was not accustomed to being refused, especially not by a lone woman he had already marked as a victim. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his tone shifting, a hint of steel now underlying the silk. "Perhaps you don't fully appreciate the situation. The bank holds the note on this property. Another failed season, and they will have no choice but to foreclose. My offer is a way to walk away with something in your pocket. It is, frankly, more than you deserve, given the state of the claim." The threat was clear now, laid bare. He had done his research. He knew she was vulnerable. But he had made a critical miscalculation. He was speaking to the woman she had been months ago, not the woman she was now. "The state of the claim will be improved by the next planting," she replied, her gaze as level and unyielding as the horizon. His eyes narrowed. "With what seed? The town talk is that your larder is as empty as your fields." His gaze shifted then, past her, toward the distant silhouette of Silas Blackwood's homestead. A look of dawning, unpleasant understanding crossed his face. "Ah," he said softly, a sneer twisting his lips. "You found a benefactor, the mysterious Mr. Blackwood. I've heard the stories about him. A deserter, they say, or worse. You should be careful, Mrs. Vance, about the company you keep. A man like that, his protection comes at a price you may not be willing to pay." The insinuation was vile. It ignited a spark of cold fury in Alara's chest. He was trying to poison the one source of hope she had, to turn her against the only person who had offered her a path forward. He was trying to isolate her again, to make her feel helpless and alone. Before she could form a reply, another presence made itself known. Silas had come up from the creek bed, moving with his usual unnerving quietness. He stood a dozen yards away, a shotgun held loosely, almost casually, in the crook of his arm. He hadn't raised it. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a physical challenge, a stark and dangerous counterpoint to Henderson's smarmy confidence. Henderson saw him, and his face paled slightly. The land agent was a man who dealt in paper threats and financial intimidation. He was not a man prepared for the quiet, absolute menace that emanated from Silas Blackwood. Silas said nothing. He just stood there, his pale eyes fixed on Henderson. The silence was more threatening than any shouted warning. Henderson, flustered, cleared his throat and turned back to his horse. "Well," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle and false. "Just an offer, ma'am. Something for you to consider." He swung himself into the saddle, his movements suddenly clumsy and rushed. He gave Silas a wide, wary berth as he rode away, kicking his horse into a canter as if eager to put distance between himself and the two silent figures who stood watching him go. Alara watched until he was a small speck once more, her fury slowly cooling into a hard, cold resolve. She looked over at Silas. He was still watching the horizon where Henderson had disappeared. He lowered the shotgun. "Men like that," he said, his voice a low growl, "they don't give up. They come back." He was not just stating a fact. He was making a promise. They would be ready. Henderson's retreat was not a defeat, merely a tactical withdrawal. As Silas had predicted, he did not give up. He simply changed his strategy. Unable to intimidate Alara directly, he turned his attention to the one weapon readily available to him: the fear and suspicion of the town of Redemption. He began to poison the well of public opinion, his whispers spreading like a fever through the small, isolated community. He painted a picture of a dangerous recluse, Silas Blackwood, preying on a vulnerable widow, taking advantage of her grief to seize her land. He hinted at dark secrets in Silas's past, embellishing the existing rumors with lurid, imagined details. He was a deserter who had left his comrades to die, a thief who had fled the law, a man whose hands were stained with blood. He framed Silas's self-sufficiency not as a virtue, but as the hoarding of a miser, a man who would let his neighbors starve while he sat on a stockpile of resources. He made Alara out to be a fool at best, a woman of loose morals at worst, shacking up with the town pariah instead of accepting the charitable help of civilized folk like himself. The poison worked quickly. On her next trip into town for supplies, a trip made with a small amount of credit Silas had given her against her future work, the change was palpable. The usual reserved greetings of the townsfolk were replaced with cold stares and averted eyes. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, who had once offered Alara a jar of preserves in sympathy, now served her with a pinched, disapproving silence, slapping her change down on the counter as if her touch might be contagious. At the smithy, where she went to ask about a new hinge for her cabin door, a group of men fell silent as she approached, their conversation only resuming in hushed, hostile tones after she had passed. She could feel their judgment like a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of scorn. They saw her alliance with Silas not as a desperate bid for survival, but as a betrayal of their community, a turning away from their unoffered help toward a man they had already condemned. The irony was a bitter pill. None of them had offered her a single seed, a day's work, or a kind word when she was truly on the verge of starvation. But now they felt entitled to judge the choice she had made to save herself. She returned to the homestead that evening, her heart heavy with a renewed sense of isolation. She had thought the loneliness of her cabin was the worst it could be, but the collective shunning of the town was a new and sharper pain. She told Silas what had happened, her voice flat and tired as she unloaded the meager supplies. He listened without interruption, his expression unchanging, though she saw a muscle tighten in his jaw. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, staring out at the setting sun, which bled across the horizon in angry streaks of red and orange. "People fear what they don't understand," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "And they hate what they fear. Henderson is giving them a reason to hate me, so they don't have to feel guilty for watching you starve." It was the most he had ever said about his relationship with the outside world. The words were stark, unpitying, but they held a core of truth that resonated deep within her. He understood the town's cruelty because he had lived with it for years. He had simply chosen to live beyond its reach. The rumors were only the beginning. Henderson escalated his campaign, moving from character assassination to direct sabotage. One morning, Silas discovered that the small diversion dam he had built upstream on the creek, which channeled a trickle of precious water toward his vegetable patch, had been smashed. The rocks were scattered, the careful construction destroyed. It was a petty, malicious act designed to strike at the heart of his survival. It would take days to repair. They worked together to rebuild it, their movements synchronized, their anger a shared, unspoken fuel. Alara felt a protective fury on Silas's behalf that surprised her with its intensity. This was not just an attack on him. It was an attack on them, on the fragile future they were trying to build. A few nights later, they were awoken by the frantic braying of Silas's mule. They rushed out of their respective cabins to find the fence to his small corral cut, the mule gone. They spent the entire next day tracking the animal, finally finding it miles away, its leg caught in a tangle of brush. It was lame but alive. The act was both cruel and calculated, meant to rob Silas of his only beast of burden, to cripple his ability to work the land. These attacks, meant to drive them apart, had the opposite effect. They forged Alara and Silas into a true partnership, their reliance on each other no longer just a matter of convenience, but of necessity. They began to take turns standing watch at night, sitting in the darkness with a rifle across their laps, guarding their shared territory against an unseen enemy. During these long, quiet hours, they talked more than they ever had before. She spoke of her life in Ohio, of the green, gentle hills that were so different from this harsh, open land. He spoke, haltingly at first, of a war, of the noise and the fear and the loss of friends, of his reasons for seeking out the most profound silence he could find. He never named the war or his role in it, but she understood that the solitude he had built around himself was not a rejection of the world, but a shield against its horrors. He was not an island because he hated the sea. He was an island because he had survived a shipwreck. The town's judgment, which had once pained her, now felt distant and irrelevant. Her world had contracted to this small patch of land, to the steady presence of the quiet man who stood watch with her in the dark. Redemption was not a place on a map. It was here, in the shared struggle, in the quiet dignity of their defiance. Henderson thought he was laying a siege, but all he was doing was building the walls of their fortress higher. The night air was unnaturally still, thick and heavy with a tension that had been building for weeks. A sliver of moon offered little light, and the stars seemed distant and cold. Alara sat on the porch of her cabin, a rifle resting across her lap, her senses on high alert. It was her turn for the first watch. In the distance, she could see the faint, steady glow of the lantern in Silas's window. They had fallen into this routine, a silent vigil against the malice they knew was circling them. The attacks had grown bolder. Last week, a portion of her own fence had been torn down, not just cut, but ripped from the ground with a viciousness that spoke of escalating rage. Henderson was growing impatient. His campaign of whispers and petty sabotage wasn't working. He wanted them gone, and his desperation was becoming dangerous. A sudden, unnatural orange flicker on the horizon, in the direction of the dry northern pasture, caught her eye. It was too bright to be a star, too low to be the moon. It pulsed, then grew, a malevolent bloom of light against the inky blackness. Fire. Her blood ran cold. She was on her feet in an instant, the rifle forgotten. Silas. The name was torn from her throat, a raw shout of alarm that shattered the night's silence. She didn't wait for a reply. She began to run, her boots pounding against the hard earth, her heart hammering against her ribs. The dry grass, baked brittle by months of drought, would go up like tinder. The fire would sweep across the pasture, destroying the winter grazing for his mule. And if the wind shifted, it could threaten the barn, the cabins, everything. She saw his cabin door burst open, his tall silhouette framed for a moment against the lamplight before he too began to run, converging with her in the darkness. He carried an axe in one hand and a bundle of wet burlap sacks in the other. He had been ready for this. The wind is from the north, he yelled over the growing roar. "It'll drive it toward the creek bed. We have to try and contain it there." There was no time for fear. There was only the fire, a living, breathing monster that consumed everything in its path. The heat washed over them as they drew closer, a searing wave that stole the breath from their lungs. The air was filled with the crackle and hiss of burning grass and the thick, acrid smell of smoke. The fire line was 100 yards wide and moving fast, a terrifying wall of orange and black. Silas thrust 2 of the wet sacks at her. "Beat at the edges. Smother it. Don't get in front of it," he shouted, his voice tight with urgency. He took the axe and began to run along the edge of the blaze, hacking at the taller clumps of brush, trying to create a rudimentary firebreak. Alara ran to the western flank of the fire, the burlap sack feeling heavy and clumsy in her hands. She began to beat at the flames licking at the edge of the inferno. The heat was immense, scorching her face and hands. Smoke filled her lungs, making her cough and choke, her eyes streaming with tears. It was a brutal, exhausting, seemingly futile task. For every small flame she smothered, a dozen more sprang up. The fire was a ravenous beast, and they were trying to fight it with sticks and wet cloth. She fell into a desperate rhythm. Swing, beat, smother, gasp for air, step, and swing again. Her world narrowed to the few feet of burning grass in front of her, the roar of the blaze, and the burning in her lungs and muscles. She lost track of time, lost track of everything but the fight. She could see Silas on the other side, a demonic figure wreathed in smoke and firelight, swinging his axe with a relentless, furious energy. He was a force of will against a force of nature, his movements economical and powerful even in the midst of chaos. They were 2 small, solitary figures battling an apocalypse of their own, their survival hanging on every swing, every smothered flame. At one point, a gust of wind sent a shower of embers raining down around her. A spark caught on the hem of her trousers. Before she could even react, Silas was there. He tackled her, throwing them both to the ground and beating out the small flame with his bare hands. "Stay low," he roared, his face black with soot, his eyes wild in the firelight. "The smoke will kill you before the fire does." He pulled her to her feet, his grip on her arm like iron, and pushed her back toward the fight. Hours passed in a smoke-filled haze of terror and exertion. They fought with the desperate strength of people who had nothing left to lose. They gave no ground, refusing to retreat, battling for every inch of scorched earth. Slowly, impossibly, their efforts began to make a difference. The fire, driven by the steady wind, reached the wider, stonier ground of the dry creek bed, where there was less fuel to consume. Their frantic work on the flanks had narrowed its front. It was contained, not defeated, but its relentless march had been halted. They stood, side by side, leaning on their tools, and watched as the fire began to burn itself out, the towering flames shrinking to a sullen, red glow. They were blackened with soot, their clothes singed, their faces streaked with a mixture of sweat and tears. Every muscle in Alara's body screamed in agony. Her lungs felt as though they had been scoured with hot sand. But they were alive. They had held the line. As the adrenaline began to fade, a profound, bone-deep exhaustion set in. She looked at Silas. He was staring into the dying embers, his chest heaving. He had a burn on his forearm, where he had beaten out the flame on her clothes. He had put himself between her and the fire without a moment's hesitation. He had saved her. She took a step toward him, her legs trembling and unsteady, and did something she would never have imagined doing. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, just above the burn. He flinched at the contact, but he didn't pull away. He simply looked down at her hand, then up at her face. In the dim, ruddy light of the dying fire, his pale eyes seemed to see right through to her soul. No words were spoken. None were needed. In the crucible of the fire, their partnership had been forged into something stronger, something unbreakable. They had faced the worst together, and they had won. In the gray, spectral light of dawn, the aftermath was a scene of stark devastation. The northern pasture was a blackened, smoking ruin, the air thick with the lingering stench of ash. The earth itself seemed wounded, a vast, open sore on the landscape. The fire had been stopped at the creek bed, a clear line of demarcation between the charred wasteland and the untouched land that held their homes, their hopes. Alara and Silas stood together on the edge of the burn, surveying the damage. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional pop and hiss from a still smoldering patch of earth. The exhaustion was a heavy cloak on Alara's shoulders, a deep ache that had settled into her very bones. But looking out at the destruction, she did not feel despair. She felt a quiet, fierce pride. They had done this. They had faced down the inferno and saved what mattered. Silas walked a few paces into the burn, his boots sinking into the thick layer of ash. He bent down, scooping up a handful of the blackened soil. He let it run through his fingers, his expression thoughtful, analytical. The fire burned hot and fast, he said, his voice raspy from the smoke. It burned the grass, but it didn't bake the life out of the soil. It will recover. The ash will feed it. It will come back greener. He was not a man given a false optimism. This was a practical assessment, a statement of fact rooted in his deep understanding of the land and its cycles of destruction and renewal. He was looking at the ruin and seeing the potential for new growth. He was seeing the future. Alara walked to stand beside him, her gaze following his. She could see it too. The land was not dead, only sleeping, waiting. It was a reflection of her own journey. She had been burned down to nothing, and from the ashes, something new and stronger was beginning to grow. He turned to look at her, his face still smudged with soot, a new harshness in the lines around his eyes. This was Henderson, he stated. It was not a question. He wanted to burn us out. All of it, the casual brutality of it settled in Alara's stomach like a cold stone. Henderson hadn't just wanted to scare them or damage their property. He had been willing to see them burn to death in their cabins, all for a piece of land. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice quiet. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a face, and it had proven its willingness to kill. Silas's pale eyes hardened, becoming chips of ice. We don't wait for him to try again. He started walking back toward his cabin, his stride long and purposeful. Get some rest. Drink water. Then meet me at my cabin. She did as he said, forcing herself to drink from her well and wash the worst of the grime from her face and hands. Every movement was an agony. An hour later, she walked to his cabin. He was on the porch, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, focused movements. Another rifle, older but well-kept, was leaning against the wall beside him. He looked up as she approached. "Do you know how to use one of these?" he asked, nodding toward the second rifle. "Thomas taught me," she said. "I'm a fair shot," he gave a curt nod. "Good." He finished with his own weapon and then began to lay out supplies on a piece of canvas. A small sack of jerky, 2 canteens, a box of cartridges. His movements were spare and efficient. He was preparing for a journey, or a hunt. "I'm going to town," he said, not looking at her. "I'm going to find Henderson. This ends today." A knot of fear tightened in her chest. She knew what he meant. He was going to confront Henderson, and a man like Silas Blackwood did not make empty threats. It would end in violence. "You can't go alone," she said, the words coming out with more force than she intended. "They'll see you coming. The whole town is against you. They'll call it murder, no matter what he's done." He paused, his hands stilling over the box of cartridges. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something uncertain in his eyes. He had spent years relying on no one but himself. The habit of solitude was a hard one to break. "He set fire to my home, Silas," she said, her voice dropping, becoming more intense. "He threatened my life. This is my fight too." She walked up the steps of the porch and stood before him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "We do this together." He studied her face for a long moment, his gaze searching. He saw not the desperate, starving woman who had come to his fence weeks ago, but a partner, an equal. He saw the same steely resolve in her eyes that he felt in his own gut. He had tried to keep the world at bay, to build a fortress of solitude, but the world had come for him anyway. And in doing so, it had brought him an ally he had never expected. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right," he said. The single word was an acceptance of so much more than her help. It was an acceptance of their partnership, an acknowledgement that his isolation was finally, truly over. He pushed the second rifle and half the cartridges toward her. "We ride in an hour." There was no more fear, only a cold, clear sense of purpose. They were no longer two separate, struggling homesteaders. They were a unified force. Henderson had meant to destroy them with fire, but he had only succeeded in forging them into a weapon. And now, that weapon was pointed directly at him. The seasons turned, chasing each other across the vast, open canvas of the plains. The angry, blackened scar on the northern pasture slowly faded, replaced first by the tender green shoots of new grass, and then by a thick, healthy carpet that waved in the prairie wind. The land had healed. It had remembered its promise. The day they rode into redemption together felt like a lifetime ago. Henderson, cornered and confronted not by one lone outcast, but by two determined survivors with the evidence of his arson fresh on their soot-stained faces, had crumbled. His bluster and threats evaporated in the face of their cold, united fury. He was gone before sunset, his ambition turning to dust as he fled the territory, leaving them in peace. The town, faced with the undeniable truth of Henderson's villainy and their own complicity, had retreated into a sullen, shamed silence. Their judgment no longer mattered. Alara's cabin, once a monument to loneliness and failure, was now used for storage. She had moved her few belongings into Silas's larger, sturdier home. It had happened naturally, without discussion or ceremony. After the fire, the idea of sleeping in separate cabins, of maintaining the fiction of their separate lives, had seemed absurd. Their survival was intertwined. Their lives might as well be too. The house, which had once been a bastion of stark, male solitude, began to change. A pot of wildflowers, gleaned from the creek bed, sat on the rough-hewn table. Curtains, sewn from an old dress, softened the light from the windows. Small changes, but they transformed the space from a shelter into a home. Silas had watched her make these changes with his usual quiet observation, but she saw the approval in his eyes, the slight softening of his mouth that was his version of smile. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but he had let her in. It was spring again. A year had passed since she had first walked to his fence line, a beggar asking for a chance. Today, they stood together in the field she had cleared of rocks with her own two hands. The soil was dark and rich, still damp from a recent, gentle rain. Between them sat a heavy sack of seed potatoes, the one she had earned. They were not his seeds or her seeds. They were theirs. She knelt, plunging her hands into the cool earth. The soil no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a partner, a collaborator in the act of creation. She remembered the desperation of digging in her own failed field, her fingers searching for anything but rot and blight. Now, her hands were confident, knowledgeable. She knew this soil. She had bled into it, sweat into it, and fought for it. Silas knelt beside her. He took a potato from the sack, its skin rough against his calloused palm. He studied it for a moment, then pressed it gently into the furrow she had dug. He covered it with earth, his movements careful, almost reverent. This was their true victory. Not driving Henderson away, not surviving the fire, but this simple act of faith. The belief that from this small, humble seed, life would come. The belief in a future. They worked their way down the row in a comfortable, practiced silence. The rhythm of their work was a conversation, a dance of shared purpose. She would dig the hole. He would place the seed. There was an easy grace to their movements, an unspoken understanding that had been forged in hardship and tempered by mutual respect. She looked at him, his head bowed to his task, the sun catching the stray silver strands in his dark hair. The harsh, intimidating stranger was gone, replaced by a man she knew better than anyone. She knew the quiet patience in his hands, the rare warmth in his pale eyes. She knew the strength of his loyalty and the depth of the old wounds he carried. He was no longer an island. He was her anchor. He must have felt her gaze, because he looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He held out a potato to her. A peace offering, an invitation. She took it from his hand, their fingers brushing. A current, gentle and warm, passed between them. It was a connection that ran deeper than words, a bond built not on grand declarations, but on 1,000 shared moments of work, of struggle, of silence. She took the potato and planted it in the rich, dark earth. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, golden shadows across their field, they finished the last row. They stood up together, brushing the soil from their hands, and looked at what they had accomplished. The field was a neat pattern of hope, a testament to their resilience. The wind whispered through the new grass on the prairie, and for the first time, it did not sound like a lament. It sounded like a promise. Alara thought of Thomas, of his dream for this land. His dream had died with him, but a new one, a tougher, more resilient dream, had taken root in its place. She was not the woman he had married. She was someone stronger, someone harder, someone who had been scoured and tested and had not been broken. She had learned to fix the things that were broken, including herself. Silas came to stand beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. He was looking out at the horizon, at the vast, endless sky. He had come here seeking solitude, but he had found something else, something better. Together, they watched the last light of the day fade, standing on their land, ready for whatever came next. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. It was everything.